Philadelphia, August 14, 1798. An ad in the Pennsylvania Gazette. For sale, 1 or 2 elegant 3-story houses with large, airy rooms made of the finest materials. Apply to Samuel Reed, Swanson Street, near Catherine. This is a part of its past America almost forgot in its rush to catch the future. Now we are discovering that in its human scale and indelible personality, the past may provide the perspective that the present has needed for so long. Most of us, headed home at 5, live in a mass production world, impersonal but efficient. It has given us better lives and a better living than our forefathers could ever have imagined. But what people like Randy Williams are concerned about is the price we pay in individuality. A self-taught carpenter, Randy is keenly aware of the differences between the natural building materials of colonial times and the artificial ones we live with today.
Very often during the day, you have a sense of being surrounded by synthetic and foreign building materials, which largely contrast with the very simple and straightforward and wholly complete building materials used in 18th century houses, such as solid wood and real plaster and hardwood floors and paneling that's not veneered or fake.
Randy was looking for a sense of individuality when he and his wife Nancy bought a house on Philadelphia's still cobblestoned Elfreth's Alley. Built as 2 houses in 1785, one in front and one in back, they had been abandoned years before. Underneath layers of paint, however, was most of the original woodwork. Studying the house and its history carefully, they began to restore it to its original appearance.
When you take on a house that was built in the 18th century and very consciously put together by craftsmen that knew a lot more than you did, you have to move very slowly or else you'll undo what they were trying to do at that time. Any old house that's been around for 200 years has left a million clues as to what it was like 200 years ago, and these clues might be in the brickwork or how one wall joins another wall. All of these are for reasons, they're not just for effect, and you have to listen to these clues, listen in the sense of seeing them and thinking about them, and that will enable you to reconstruct what went on in the minds of the people that built the house originally.
For most of the younger people who have chosen to own a part of America's past, restoring it is a do-it-yourself project. For Don Rossi and Luciano Moral, a do-it-yourself restoration has meant working nights and weekends, plus most holidays and vacations. As with the Williamses, economic necessity taught them new skills and how to live patiently with trial and error. Like many of the other houses in Philadelphia's Queen Village, the Rossi house is small, only 2 rooms on each floor. It was built by a carpenter in 1740. By the time Don found it, it had endured 200 years of updating that left the facade badly scarred. In spite of that, the interior was still good. There was paneling intact. Most of the floors and doors were original, and even some of the hardware. And when you're working to preserve a heritage, that's what counts most. In Society Hill, a short walk from Queen Village, many of the 18th century houses are larger and more formal. Not everyone who buys one, however, plans on preserving its elegant past. John Griswold is curator of birds for the Philadelphia Zoological Garden. He and his wife bought their Society Hill house simply because it was convenient, had a garden and a garage. They planned to restore only the facade and stopped there. Now, 16 years later, John and Lee Griswold are finishing one of the most authentic restorations in Philadelphia, even to fitting each window pane with 18th century glass.
In this particular house, Joseph Hopkinson lived. Young Joe, as we call him affectionately, moved into this house with his bride, Emily Mifflin, who was the only daughter of the governor of Pennsylvania. He was one of the sons of Francis Hopkinson, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from the New Jersey delegation. And in 1798, Joseph sat down and wrote Hail Columbia. And Hail Columbia was such an immediate success, it almost, in fact, was our national anthem. It goes something like, Hail Columbia, happy land, da-da-dee-da-dee-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dum-dum, da-da-da. As far as I can go. I am ashamed that in 16 years I've been working so hard in the house I can't even sing the song. But that's the thing I shall learn to do for next year.
We feel we have an obligation here. Now, this didn't come about immediately. It came about gradually as we discovered more and more things that were original and authentic. And we felt, well, we shouldn't really desecrate it and put up modern plywood or something. So we began restoring the house completely as it was, or pretty much so, in the 18th century.
Well, I suppose the major find and the most exciting one was our 18th century kitchen. Gus started chipping away at the walls one night, and there was the evidence of the original 18th century fireplace with the bake oven intact and the archway underneath where they used to hold the kindling. We didn't know what to do. First, I said, let's take it out. You know, my first feeling was, let's get rid of it. You know, it's going to spoil my plans. But then we began to think about it a little more seriously, and we really felt that maybe we should do something about it.
Well, I think this is another perfect example, the room we're in right here, which was originally a store, and last it was a laundry. Before that, it was a photographic developing room. There wasn't anything in here, no woodwork at all. But fortunately, on this paneling here, we were able to pick it up in an antique dealer 12 years ago, and it came out of a house in Ray Street right near here, and it's our 18th century paneling. It's almost identical to what we have upstairs. The assurance survey says that this was like the room upstairs. So we replaced it with the original paneling, and we're very fortunate to find it that it just fitted in here. This is 18th century wallpaper that was up on the second floor hallway. And my wife was picking off the plaster, this calcimine here, and she finally came down to this. Knowing that this looked like an original paper, we called in the Park Service, and they came and photographed and took the colors of this and had it reproduced. And they gave us enough for the reproduction to replace where this wallpaper originally was and put in the reproduction paper. Prior to restoring the house, we did gather materials for close on to 3 years. Now, this included old nails, old doors and 18th century hinges, 18th century locks, and we have tried to use these in the restoration.
This is the original door, which is twice the thickness of a modern door. The paneled side was on the outside, and the board or batten side faced into the hallway. We have the original 18th century HL hinges. However, the door lock was gone. When we cleaned the paint off of the door, we saw the mark where the lock originally had been. This particular lock came from a church in Trapp, Pennsylvania. You notice the doorknob and the key stick away from the lock. This fits back into this little box which we found covered over in the wall, and they both fit neatly into the wall.
Being purists, we didn't want to put a modern mailbox slot in our 18th century door. Even today, if we get a new postman, he never can find the mail slot because it blends in so well with the brickwork in the wall. I installed a bell pull on the front door, which is a combination of wire and levers. It's very similar to what they had in a simplified form in the 18th century. When we bought the house, they had stripped the inner banister off the beautiful stairway. But our greatest fortune was that we found a duplicate with all its complicated curves and returns, and this was usually done on the spot, so it's very seldom that you could ever find one to match. And it did match perfectly, and we were able to place it in and make this restoration in the staircase 100% authentic.
For every historic American house saved, there are dozens of others still waiting for restoration. Like the houses that Sam Reed built and advertised in 1798, their elegance has faded, and every year that passes brings them closer to structural decay and dilapidation. Initially, a major stimulant to the private restoration of colonial homes in Philadelphia was the National Park Service, through its development of Philadelphia's Independence National Historical Park in the 1950s. But the houses that the National Park Service restores are destined to be public museums, not private residences. The goal is not personal comfort, it is painstaking authenticity. And unlike the Park Service, the average person cannot afford the time or money to chemically analyze the mortar between the bricks in order to duplicate it in his finished restoration. Penny Batchelor, restoration architect, explains.
The private individual must live in the house, and therefore they need a modern kitchen, perhaps in a room where we just would put a library because that was the library. And so you run into that kind of variation in restorations, but each has its own place. One of the National Park Service projects is the Deshler-Morris house, which is outside of Philadelphia in Germantown. This was the site of George Washington's summer White House, you might say. He was escaping the raging yellow fever epidemic that was going on here in the center of the city, and he had to get out of town for his own safety and his family's. And the Park Service is now restoring this house to tell that story. It's a difficult problem because this house has grown. It started out as just a back building set in from the street. And then they added the front building in the 1770s, and then it grew by slow increments right up to 1909 when the last appendage was put on. The problem really is, what do you save and what don't you? What do you do with all of these back wings and all of these additions? Well, it's been determined that we are going to save the majority of them because they are useful in making the house function. But the principal aim of the Park Service is to restore the front building where the story is to be told to the 1772 period. One of the greatest helps to any restorationist, whether the National Park Service or a private individual, is being able to refer to what's called a fire insurance survey. A survey made by a man who physically came down and looked at the house and wrote down what he saw was of value in the construction of that house. These surveys survive, fortunately, in the archives of the fire insurance companies that are still going on. For instance, at the Kosciuszko house, one of the houses we're restoring, the house was 15 by 31.5 feet, 3 stories high, a board newel stair, finished in a good plain way, a frontispiece to the front door, and painted inside and out. And I dwell on the word frontispiece because when we received this house to restore, there was no first floor. It had been changed to a corner store. The problem was how to restore the missing first floor. If we hadn't had this fire insurance survey telling us there was a frontispiece, we wouldn't have known to emphasize the front door with a decorative element of a pediment over it and pilasters on the side, making it a very elegant entrance to the house. Practically every house that's been restored in the Philadelphia Old City area has a similar fire insurance survey. The fire hazard was considerable because not only were the houses heated by open fireplaces or open stoves, sparks could fly from that one house and land on the roof of a neighbor and ignite the wood shingle roof.
Haunted by memories of the Great London Fire, William Penn permitted only masonry buildings in his capital city. One reason Philadelphia has so many colonial buildings intact today. Though a fire engine had been imported from London by 1718, organized firefighting did not begin in Philadelphia until 1735, when Ben Franklin and several other citizens established the first fire brigade. Fire marks, which identified a company insuring a building, came into use about 1752 and guaranteed a handsome reward to volunteer brigades, which formerly were dependent on a homeowner's generosity for their pay. Since the first brigade to reach the fire was entitled to the entire reward, competition was fierce, and when the race to the scene ended in a tie, it was not uncommon for the brigades to battle each other instead of the blaze. Like the daily use of an open fire, the function of fire marks on houses and public buildings has long since disappeared. We no longer rely on open fires for heat and light, but restored homes are often furnished with antiques or with accurate reproductions. While brass fixtures were often used in 18th century drawing rooms, kitchen fixtures and fireplace tools were usually the work of a craftsman like the tinsmith. Today, the need for authentic reproductions has given a new impetus to craftsmen who work with designs and patterns that were popular in colonial America. One of the best-known craftsmen is tinsmith Joseph Messersmith of Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania.
About 18 years ago, Andrew Wyeth came up and asked me to make him a pallet. Then Betsy Wyeth said to me that she would like to have a chandelier like hanging in Washington's headquarters over the dining room table. And she said, well, if you can make a pallet for Andy, there's no reason why you can't make the chandelier for me. So that's how we got started. Of course, back in those days, they didn't have a tinsmith in this country. It wasn't until the late 1700s that the tinsmiths arrived here. Before that, you only had the blacksmith. He was the wheelwright, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the tinsmith, you name it, and he was it. Then when the tinsmiths arrived, they arrived up in Connecticut, and then they started to spread out. And as they came on down through New York State, Pennsylvania, and on down through Maryland and so on, the people in that area would draw for them a sconce and say, we would want you to make this. Well, you can pretty near look at the sconce and tell where it was from. Take, for instance, there's one from Harrisburg, has the perforation in it, denoting the Dutch design. There's another one with a tulip top, Dutch design. Now, when you get down into Virginia, it's more Frenchy. But then when you get into some of the Pennsylvania area where you had the Quakers, that's very plain, very simple, and this is what the way the Quakers like. You know, you can pretty near tell by just to look at them.
A second craft that's often important in restoring more primitive colonial homes is stenciling, a technique Americans frequently use to add brightness and pattern to otherwise very plain houses. Few American craftsmen still work in that field. One who is frequently commissioned to work out an 18th century design on the walls of a restored house is artist Kenneth Fortney.
Stenciling in this country began as a very inexpensive imitation of woven rugs and printed wallpapers, which were being produced in France and also England, and then were imported. In most cases, the stenciler was not a trained artist. In some instances, he was maybe even a tinsmith or a blacksmith at one time of the day. Another time of the day he did stenciling, or maybe even a tailor who applied his hand at that art. In the attic of some houses, they found examples that were put on the wall space by the stenciler to show the lady of the house what was available, what his kit could provide in terms of pattern and design, and she would then choose patterns that she wanted used in the house. I think the charm of stenciling is the fact that you just begin, and you start at one end of a wall and you go across to the other side of the room, and whatever happens when you get to the other side happens. Sometimes you have to cut the pattern in half. You might have 3 inches of empty space on the right and 1 inch on the left of the room. It's very difficult to plan it out ahead of time. The brush technique that you would use for stenciling is known as stippling, which is a bouncing up and down motion against the floor or wall surface. The stippling technique allows a very small amount of paint to be used, and that in turn gives you a very clear edge around the stencil.
In the restoration of America's more elegant past, the stenciler plays no role. Rich men like Alexander Barclay were provided by London and Philadelphia merchants with fine wallpapers, oriental carpets, and hand-carved furniture in the latest Chippendale fashion. Barclay, controller of the Port of Philadelphia, built this house in the 1750s. By the 1950s, it was badly dilapidated and no longer used as a house. Now carefully furnished in much the same way Barclay himself would have had it, the house has been restored with the most detailed authenticity by a Philadelphia family. Equally detailed in the attention it pays to colonial architecture is the facade of Nancy Brewster Grace's house.
We had to be very careful in our restorations. The facade was overseen continually by the Historical Society. The color of the mortar was supervised. We were not able to change the shapes of the windows. We were able to do anything on the inside of the house, but nothing on the outside that wasn't authentic.
But restoration is not the only approach to rehabilitating a colonial house. Hidden behind the garden wall, the 18th century architecture of Nancy Grace's house is transformed into 20th century walls of glass. Well-traveled with cosmopolitan interests and enthusiasms, Nancy Grace has preserved the best of the past and shown how well it can be adapted to the present.
My instinct is for the contemporary. I think that modern architecture produces the tie-up between the indoors and the outdoors that one likes to live in today. There's really no reason, we felt, to reproduce things which were not part of our lives. This house did not wish to be changed. We tore out walls, we changed the structure, we changed the shapes of rooms, and the house reacted very negatively by refusing to be built. The roof of the terrace was built 3 times. Each time the bricks were taken off, each time they were replaced, each time it leaked. The trees were moved around and many of them died. I had lived in Indonesia a great deal, and I understood about spirits. In America, one might think of ghosts, but in Indonesia, one thinks of spirits. In Indonesia, one makes a selamatun to a house or to a building. Rice and eggs are made an offering. I used to come at times with a little handful of rice or several eggs, which I hid about in the basement or in the roof. And some of the workmen were rather surprised when they found these. But the spirits were not surprised. And the spirits eventually decided that the house could be finished. If you have lunch today, you're actually sitting in a glass-enclosed 18th century alley. The architect broke through the wall of the house into an alley to provide space for a powder room, many closets, a pantry, and a dining alcove. The house is full of surprises. Children like the house, and there are quite a few nice things for children. They like finding the swimming pool, and there's a secret room on the 3rd floor that children like.
For the men and women who have chosen to restore and live in the houses of America's past, the rewards have been many. The difficulties and frustrations pass, and what remains is a great sense of satisfaction. Beyond the pleasure of accomplishment is the awareness that they have created a continuity with the past, and perhaps that helps to make the present less transient. They own in reality the American past that others come to take pictures of, and they have helped to preserve that past for the future. That is what they are most proud of.
I think they're reliving a part of history. They're updating it. They're keeping history alive.
I think it's very nice. I think they should build more like it. I mean, this is what they, in 1776, this is what they wanted. So they built it that way. Today, everything is so modern that you don't know if you're coming or going in the building.
Well, I think they're trying to keep the best of the past to live in a modern world.
Our heritage, that's it. That's the whole thing. They're keeping our heritage alive.
A lot of detail in the architecture, not like our plain woodwork. You know, it's beautiful.
It's very beautiful. I was a carpenter. I know what it's like to produce that kind of goods.
We have our map here. I just bought 3 Liberty Bell replicas, which go back for paperweights, and really enjoyed it.
You wonder what they were like at that time. And I think about Betsy Ross's kitchen and how I'm glad I don't have to cook in it.
I think they're great. They're beautiful compared to the things we're living in now, most of them. You know, the modern, I think they're great.
I'm from Alaska. These are about the oldest buildings I think I've ever seen, and I'm surprised they're in the condition yet to this day that they are.
It makes you feel like you'd like to put yourself back in them days when they lived here, and it just gives you a special feeling. Well, it's sort of pride in the way the country was in them days. It's all just very great.
It's history, you know. You can see the site where Betsy Ross sewed the flag and everything. It's good education for younger children. For anybody, really. It's pretty neat. I don't see how it stood up for so long. Going around.